a little bit concerned. So I'm kind of maybe a realist about AI. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, but there's also a tremendous amount of risk associated with AI. And so we just need to make sure that we do a good job of balancing it. And I think the EU AI Act does some good things towards that, but there's also some things it does to contribute to some of the risk. And I think one of the serious things that it does to contribute to some of the risk we talked about at FII, which is this whole concept that I've been talking about and others started talking about more recently, that I frame up as technological colonialism, which essentially is because all these models are being built in the West and in China, or by Westerners and Chinese for the most part, and primarily by men, and white men at that, and Indian men at that, and Chinese men. You're basically ingraining that culture into these models. And these models, when we think about especially these language models, these pre-trained models, you're pre-training all these things in there. Now, the EU AI Act, one of the things they have in there is that these models need to be bias tested. Now, that's great on the surface, but you're testing these models and the EU is requiring that there are some controls around bias. But what is the definition of bias and whose definition of bias is it? Well, it's the EU's definition of bias. And so now you're ingraining a Western definition of bias into a model that the whole world needs access to, because essentially if you don't have access to this technology, you're going to be left behind. And so we're essentially we're inflicting our Western ethos on the rest of the world by doing this. And so this is a risk of this technology, because these models are being trained, again, by a very small group of people. And so this is how something that is intended to do good, which the EU, they're really trying to do something good by doing this, but it has negative consequences because people don't understand the effects of it.
You were talking about the cultural influences to the processes before. What are some examples of how that matters, like Western versus?
So if you look at male-female, every culture cares about male-female bias, right? Mm-hmm. Racial bias, we care about racial bias.
But I think that there is a challenge with democratizing access to the technology, so we can have a diversity of people that are building and training the models that will be used to drive the future. We're currently running a series in Europe called Prompting Europe to talk about the EU AI Act in 5 cities. And one of the things that was so striking when we were there was just last week in Amsterdam, there's 100 people, and their biggest problem was nothing that's getting built works in Dutch. And so now it's a national imperative to actually build an LLM in Dutch.
If you have a white male, Chinese male, Indian male designing a system that still outputs fair results, why does it matter?
So how do you define fair results?
I have no idea.
So let me take that.
It sounds like a classic nonprofit failure. And the question is, did you have the right incentive model in place to build the right thing? Or was this a great project for people who feel good about making the third world a better place, and they really didn't know it very well? You could argue if that was potentially a for-profit business, and
it was a for-profit business.
Monsanto is very much a for-profit business.
You also
that was a leadership failure for not recruiting your customers and understanding what they're doing. So I don't think it's biased.
No, that's what I was saying. No, I was saying it wasn't. Sorry, I was saying it wasn't biased. It was we didn't understand the problem. That's what
but you
I was saying.
also have to
thing.
remember that outside of America, iPhones are the minority.
For many years with M-Pesa in the early days, people in the West not understanding how it worked, even though it was pretty simple.